Welcome to Cincy Reformed Podcast. I'm Pastor Brandon, joined again with Pastor Zac. We're pastors at Westside Reformed Church, a URC congregation in Cincinnati, Ohio. And today I thought I would interview Zac. Zac is a church planter, but now Westside has particularized, and he's very much in the church planting world. You're on the church planting committee, and you think a lot about church planting. You've been doing it for a long time, been thinking about it for a long time, studying it for a long time. And so there's many out there who might be in a similar vein in terms of planting a church or thinking of planting a church. There's also many people who are part of church plants or might one day be part of a church plant. And so thinking, I think, about church planting, both from the perspective of a minister and the perspective of a congregant, I think could be helpful. And so I have some questions that I wanted to ask Zac and kind of get his wisdom and reflection on. The first question, how did you prepare to be a church planter? Did you just one day get up and do it? Like what prepared you to do this?
I think there are a lot of life experiences that play into things. I might not have even been seeking training at the time, but it was helpful in terms of training. I mean, I spent a number of years working with Campus Crusade for Christ and then InterVarsity on college campuses, and those years were specifically over in Europe. And so there's a lot of engaging with apologetic questions and learning to explain Christianity in simple ways, and not assuming a real that people to whom I'm ministering have a wealth of biblical background. And so I think that was helpful, because even if our church began with people who were already Christians, but there's still a lot of explanation that needed to occur, of catechesis that needed to occur to help just explain why we were so weird and why we are still pretty weird in comparison with the run-of-the-mill church nowadays. But I think that there was an element of that for me, where just some experience, and I think that anybody who is aspiring to be a church planter as a pastor, I mean, there are, I'm sure, many ways of having growing in your experience with sharing the gospel with people who are unbelievers, or working with people who are maybe antagonistic toward Reformed Christianity, learning how to guide all sorts of different people. I mean, because guiding men or women or older people or younger people toward the Reformed confessions and Reformed worship, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so I think having a lot of diverse experiences with different people is important. I think that, of course, seminary training, I think, is essential. I as one of my former professors would say, you don't want to go to a hospital and have surgery from a surgeon who just got an online degree, or maybe he was just really good with his hands, and so he became a surgeon. You want someone who's really well trained. And how much more should that be the case if we're talking about someone who's a physician of the soul? And so I think that just having that sort of an informed view of the Christian tradition, the Reformed tradition as well within that, and how to undertake our practical theology to bring our doctrine and biblical understanding to bear is essential. So yeah, I mean, I think seminary training is huge. There's some good books out there as well. The URC has a church planting manual you can get for free on the URCNA.org website. And I believe you can also order that for very little. I believe at Reformed Fellowship has copies of that for minimal purchase price. That's very good. The OPC has a handbook for church planting as well, which I found to be very helpful too. Those are a few things.
Yeah, and so like as you were you're coming to a close on seminary, thinking about church planting, was there internships that you did or?
Yeah. I mean, I was really proactive in seeking out training because I wanted to be a church planter, and so sought out on one hand a church that was formerly a church plant, and so I was at Oceanside United Reformed Church. They were a church plant in the URC, and they still have a bit of that church plant vibe to it. It's not a stereotypical URC by any stretch. And so I wanted to be part of that, and then that afforded me opportunities to speak with the pastor there, Daniel Hyde, about church planting, and he had done some writing on that and teaching on that topic, and still does. It also did an internship at Christ Reformed Church in Washington, D.C. It's no longer a church plant now, but it still has that feel to it again. Back when I was there, it was a church plant, and so that gave me lots of an opportunity to just experiment with what does this mean to be a church planter in a confessional and urban context, and to have 30,000 foot view conversations with the church planter there, Brian Lee, and to even begin to dialogue with him about what it might mean to plant a church in Cincinnati. And I can't even tell you how many drafts I went through in terms of documentation of what a plan might look like. I mean, I'm sure that what actually came to pass later on looked nothing like my first draft, but I think the whole practice of going through and articulating what might occur is just a helpful practice, and we've seen that in later years with Madison and Indianapolis as well. But,
sure. Yeah. And so as you had your eyes on Cincinnati, was there any groundwork at kind of on the ground, boots on the ground, Cincinnati? Was there work that you did to kind of till the soil a bit before you launched?
Yeah, and it looked different for Cincinnati than it did for Madison and Indianapolis. And in case our listeners are not quite sure, we've spearheaded 2 more church plants since ours particularized or organized. We've been working with Madison, Indiana, and Indianapolis, Indiana. And I think it's maybe helpful to just mention those 2 because the 3 of ours have not looked at all the same. They've been very different and followed different, paths. And so for us in Cincinnati, it was kind of spearheaded by me as a church planter. And I was put in touch with a few people who were interested in forming a core group. And so we did advertisements to try to publicize some initial Bible studies, to try to create a bit of a core group that believed in the vision of planting a confessional liturgical Reformed church in Cincinnati. Some of the other Reformed churches in Cincinnati were also helpful and encouraging toward us and toward me. And so they welcomed me into their pulpits to speak and to raise the profile of what we were trying to do in the West Side. And so New City PCA helped out in that regard. What's now called Good Shepherd OPC, Living Hope PCA, they all were very kind. They were especially kind. North Cincinnati Community Church. And so that just helped raise the profile of things and helped us to find a couple more families that were interested in a work in the West Side. When we think about Madison is a bit more of like a long kind of thing we did, where Colin came to Cincinnati, and it's only about an hour away from his hometown of Madison. And so he used Cincinnati as a bit of a launch point to kind of begin to work in Madison, and that spread out over the course of a couple of years, where he did a summer internship with us after he had previously sent a bunch of newsletters. During the summer internship, though, he led Bible studies there weekly and met with contacts, and then people from that fledgling group started to drive to Cincinnati to worship with us. Then Colin came back and moved to Madison for another internship year and continued to work with that core group and develop it. And so that was kind of spread out for a period of time as he was able to bring a core group together. For Indianapolis was different in that we were working with families in a core group already, but we did not have a church planter. And so that created a whole bunch of other different kinds of issues. But, again, it's just trying to get the word out, trying to find, on one hand, people who really believe in your particular vision, maybe even people who are new to the city who want to begin a church plant, but also to be open to people who are not Christians or just simply trying to figure out where are they within the Christian tradition. And so,
yeah, that's helpful. So as as we're thinking about church planning and all the work that goes into it, and starting this thing, and gathering a core group, doing all the necessary things that a church planner must do, obviously requires money. It requires funding. It requires backers. Is that part of the process in church planting, to get sponsors and these things? What are some ways that maybe you found out helpful?
Yeah, there are some out there who might advocate and say that you don't need to have funding for a church planter. They can just be bivocational, work a 9 to 5, and then do church planting on top of that. If you can do that, that's great. I don't understand how in the world that's possible to also do that and maintain your sanity, because from the very beginning, you are not just the church planter as a pastor, but you're also the elder and the deacon, and you're the setup team and tear down team. You're everything at the very beginning, and then you recruit people to help so you can what's the term I'm looking for? Delegate. Thank you. That's the term. Delegate some responsibility, of course, but I think that the funding is very important, and we certainly raise money from within our core group as to give to their church, but also we sought avenues within our regional assembly, our classis, aka presbytery, and then across our federation. I mean, sending newsletters is very key. I mean, I traveled a little bit here and there to preach in different pulpits so they can get to know me and get to know our church plant and do presentations on that. Spoke with people who could put me in touch with donors who were very passionate about church planting. But I think a lot of it's just trial and error and just get to work and try to figure out what works, because it's going to look different in the URC today than it did 10 years ago when we started. It's going to look different in one classes to another. If you're in a Baptist world, it's going to look different there than a Reformed world. I mean, it's going to look different. So I think you just need to be very diligent in what you're doing. Send out handwritten thank you letters. Be very proactive in everything you're doing. And it's just a lot of work.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking to maybe a young church planter, what were maybe some of the key priorities that the young church planter should focus on? What were some priorities that you really focused on as you were beginning the mission field?
You definitely have to prioritize, because if you don't, you're going to be, you're not going to do anything well. And I think you just have to set your expectations initially that things are going to fall through the cracks. You cannot do big church at all day one. We're not even doing big church 10 years in. You have to have the expectations adjusted very clearly to say, what's at the heart of our identity? Who are we going to be? And so therefore, what are we going to prioritize and do really, really well? We decided very early on that we were going to begin right away with 2 Lord's Day services on Sundays, and we were going to have, as much as we could, have fellowship meals together. And once we were able to have the Lord's Supper, we were going to have that weekly. And so there were all sorts of programs that we couldn't do right away. We kind of added later on with more catechesis for kids and stuff. But we were just going to do, at the very beginning, as well as we possibly could, 2 worship services, Hyde of the sacraments, and we're going to eat together. And that was about everything you could possibly do to make that happen. I don't even know how many hour weeks I was working early on. If you ask my wife, she thankfully didn't have kids at the time, but it was very busy. But I think, you just need to tailor back to say, what are we all about here? And I hope a Reformed person comes to some similar conclusions that we came to. But people outside the Reformed tradition might conclude differently. But I think you have to very much say right away that the things that you're used to pastors doing in other contexts, you just simply can't do them. And so along with those things, we would then begin to build very deeply into our core group in terms of a Reformed identity, because they needed to understand why we were doing what we were doing, why we were so weird, and we were okay with being weird. And so I think that kind of deep dive into our Belgic confession, especially what we used, that was key to charting a course going forward.
That's helpful, yeah. And so, I mean, you're obviously involved in church plants, other church plants. You're on the church planting committee. You hear of other church plants around. What are some ways that you've seen church planters engage the community that's been effective?
It's going to differ so wildly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's an opportunity we see in Madison right now that Colin has, because it has a lot more of a small town feel to it. And he genuinely runs into people that he's met before, he's ministered to before, visitors, and he'll run into them at the supermarket. He'll just see them out and about. And I think that creates a real opportunity in a small town that's very different from a more suburban or metropolitan area, because we don't see people again when you've come across them the one time. And so I think that adjusts the calculus a little bit. I think Colin has seen some fruit in, the kind of old school hanging things on doors, or having like a vacation Bible school and things like that, which I don't think necessarily is as effective in an urban place. We spent some time at some summer festivals and got booths to pass out literature and about our church and goodies that would remind people of our church, and that didn't really lead to anybody visiting ever. But I think it was probably worthwhile at the beginning, especially for our people to spend time together and to be proactive in these respects. But I do think it very much has to be adjusted to where you are, what kind of a population you're reaching, what sort of people, what does your context welcome. We sent out flyers, like mailers, to the town of Harrison, which is just west of here. And we had people just come to a Bible study off the back of flyers, because again, it operates like a small town. But you would never do that if you're here within our metropolitan, freeway loop that goes around Cincinnati. No one would ever respond to a mailer and go to a Bible study with a pastor they've never met before and see people they've never met before. But so I think it's very contextually driven in terms of what's appropriate and what's frankly just practical to do. Sure. You don't want to waste your time or waste resources when you're already stretched. So
sure, yeah. Before I came to Westside, I remember I was pastoring at a church that was a couple hundred years old, and I remember some of our early days in a coffee shop, and we were chatting about just pastoral ministry and various challenges, and I noticed, we both had different challenges, but being in an established church of a couple hundred years old yielded different challenges, and you kind of had some of the opposite challenges. Oh, yeah. And so what are some of those challenges of a church planter that might be unique to church planting?
I think the biggest one that we're still feeling today is the lack of a church building to call home, and like a brick and mortar to help people situate you. I think that's made it hard for us to develop a really great outreach strategy, because where are we? I mean, we began in one part of the West Side. We were currently in another part of the West Side. We have had a few points in time where we thought we might be closing in on a church building, and that would have completely changed our outreach strategy at that point. And so I think that's been one of the biggest things to us, is just having a facility and having a neighborhood around our facility that gives us a sense of permanence and rootedness. Whereas right now we just, we're pack up, we unpack on a Sunday morning, we pack up when Sunday morning finishes, and then we're living out of a suitcase in the rest of the week. And so I think that's a huge challenge that we face. And I think also within Cincinnati, maybe less so in other parts of the country and other parts of even our state, but I think people expect to see a church building. And if you don't have one, then it's just kind of, you're looked at as being a cult and being really weird. Again, maybe not so much like that in the East or West Coasts, but I think here there's still an expectation that a church has a church building. And if you don't, then you're probably weird. And so, well, we are weird in some ways. I don't think we're that weird. So, I think that's been a real struggle to get to that point, to have resources, to have a property, and to have develop a better strategy around a brick and mortar. So I think that's been difficult as well.
Yeah. So we talked about some of the challenges, but what are some of the great things about being a church plant? I mean, there's probably some blessings as well.
Yeah, there are definitely some great blessings. One more challenge I'll mention, just in case somebody's watching or maybe some people in church plant. I think one of the great challenges is the lack of manpower as well, and not wanting to overextend your own church, your own people, because you can't compromise the sheep who are coming to you for the sake of other sheep. If you're not taking care of the ones that the Lord has entrusted to you, then why would he ever entrust other sheep to you? And so I think that that's a really important thing. You want to push people to be courageous in outreach, but you also don't want to have so much going on that you actually burn out the people that have placed their soul in your care. And so I think that's a big challenge as well, the lack of manpower, along with the lack of officers and things to help lead. But opportunities are all over the place. I mean, I just have loved being a church planter. Even though there are lots of trials, as you can probably tell, hearing me talk and see my face here, lots of trials still. But I think that that opportunity to help people discover a Reformed tradition and to recognize the comfort of biblical Christianity has been just everything. And I always tell Colin, Madison, and Austin, Indianapolis, in church planting, the highs are higher, the lows are lower. And so when you have those great highs, like, just hold on to those things, remember those things, because it'll help you get through the low times. But, you have people coming through your doors who might never go through another church, but they, for some reason, they've found you, or you found people who are completely burnt out with Christianity of the kind of revivalistic sort and the evangelical cotton candy that's given to them every week, or the legalistic Roman Catholicism that they've gotten, and you're able to. I think you find more people like that, and you can still find those in established churches. Don't get me wrong, but you really are front and center with those kinds of people in a church plant environment, and getting to see them come to recognize just how comforting Christ is, and how beautiful Reformed worship is, and to really help shape people into a new sort of piety that's biblical and rooted in the Christian tradition. And so I think those are some real exciting things. It's also, I've also appreciated not having to deal with things that many others like, the fights over the color of carpets and those kinds of things. We can't afford those kind of fights because, I mean, we don't even have our own carpet to fight over. So, I think that we've kind of felt like we're in that wartime mentality all the time, where we're just happy to be together and we're happy to join arms with one another. And I think that kind of a culture is really fun to be part of, even though it can be pretty nerve-wracking at times. Mm-hmm. So
kind of turning our gaze maybe to someone who's thinking about joining a church plant, someone who's thinking about being part of a church plant. What would your advice be to that congregant who's going to maybe join and support a church plant?
Please don't go into it and try to make it in your own image. I think we've been very blessed in our church not having had too much of that. But I think that there have been a few that came to our church who thought they were going to create us into this kind of a church or that kind of a church because we're small, and they saw me as being a younger pastor and they thought maybe they can change me or something along those lines. But it's just really not fair to the pastor, the church plants, and the denominations behind it, the oversight that's behind it. And so I think that going into it as someone who's ready to receive and to be shaped rather than to shape, I think is very important. I think going in without all the expectations that you might have for a big church is also important. To not be making demands on day one for like a kids program, or well, what are we doing for the married couples, or what about a group for the singles, or a group for people who like to do whatever, underwater basket weaving group or something. I think that just recognizing that there's a lot, it's much more minimalist in terms of what can be done. And I think that's an opportunity actually to leave behind personal preferences and to see yourself engaged in a much more minimalist capacity with other people. And it's a really beautiful thing. But I think you have to leave the expectations at the door and to be okay with certain things falling through the cracks, be okay with, not having a facility, and be okay with change, because it will change. And church plants will change very fast, because the second you add 20 people to a church plant, you might have just doubled the church. And all of a sudden the church culture is completely different than it was back when you were 20 people. Now it's 40, or now it's 60. And it's very different now than it was last year or 2 years ago. And you could be left thinking, well, where's my church? The church that I joined a long time ago is no longer here. I say, well, what is your church? It's the Word and Sacrament ministry. It's the communion of the saints, and the saints can change over the course of time, but our calling toward each other is still the same. And so I think that those kinds of recognition that of lots of volatility, lots of change, and don't burn yourself out. Those kinds of things are, I think, really important. Wait on God's timing.
That's helpful. Is there anything else you wanted to say about church planting before we close? Or
I just say be really, as much as you can, be really humble about it. Be a student of it. I hope I'm still a student of it. I try to be. I don't think that you can always record these things in books. I think a lot of the time it just comes through talking to people who are living it and just being willing to try something and to see how it goes. But I think that just being as much of a humble student with the process as you can is important. While then having like very firm convictions about your doctrine, your worship, and those kinds of non-negotiables. But then, being ready to learn from people who come to your church, learn from fellow church planters, I think is, really, really important. So
yeah. Well, I hope that this was a helpful episode for you. You can visit our other episodes at cincyreform.org, and you can visit us at westsidereform.org. Thanks for stopping by.